Like all farmers, when you see you have water coming onto your land, you immediately think you want to get rid of it. But now I understand how peat bogs work, I now buy it. If I can keep the water on the bog, then I can farm working with nature, happily next to the bog.
Scotland's peatlands are a vital part of its natural environment and its economy. They cover 20% of Scotland's land area, accounting for some 2 million hectares. That's over 7,000 square miles.
Peatlands are a very important part of the water cycle. They actually hold water in the uplands and gradually let it flow into the lowlands, and they also have a very important role from a biodiversity point of view. Peatlands are very extensive and they support a wide range of wildlife, for example curlews, golden plover, dragonflies and large heath butterflies, and lots of different plants like sundews and very interesting sphagnum mosses as well. The lowland raised bogs are found in the lowlands, and they tend to form a dome as the peat accumulates, and that peat accumulates over thousands of years. Blanket bogs require much more rainfall, and they tend to blanket the countryside at higher altitudes where we've got very large amounts of rain coming down, and so they tend to cover much more extensive areas. Peatlands can have quite a massive effect on climate change. Where peatlands have been drained and they are drying out, they put carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere at quite a fast rate, because peat we're standing on contains about 50% carbon, and so as that dries out it actually puts it into the atmosphere, so it's adding to the potential for climate change. So what we're trying to do is actually hold that carbon in place by re-wetting the peatlands up and actually accumulating carbon over a long period of time. Trees are very good at holding on to carbon in the short term, but we have to take into account what happens to those trees in the longer term. If the trees continued growing, they would continue storing carbon, but eventually we chop trees down and they're used for other purposes, and that carbon eventually goes back into the atmosphere. Bogs, on the other hand, tend to be a much longer term type of game, where they're holding on to carbon for thousands of years rather than perhaps a shorter cycle of up to 100 years.
Scotland's peatlands, however, are eroding and degrading. 70% of our blanket bogs and 90% of raised bogs are damaged, adversely impacting upon us all.
There's been a lot of pressure on our peatlands in the last few centuries in Scotland, and particularly and perhaps most obviously in terms of the extent of drainage that we've installed in our peatlands. The effect of this drainage in terms of flooding has been to increase the rate and the amount of water that reaches the river network. Now you can imagine that in a lot of scenarios that actually exacerbates flooding. The other thing to say, and perhaps most obviously, is that peatland restoration reduces greenhouse gas emissions, and that obviously reduces the rate of climate change. And the thing about climate change and flooding is that we anticipate that climate change will increase the likelihood and the intensity of flooding in the future. So of course anything that reduces that rate of change, such as peatland restoration, can only have a positive effect. The other benefit, of course, of peatland restoration is that we're often restoring, eroded bare peatland with vegetation, with peatland vegetation. And we do know that that vegetation actually slows down the rate of overland flow and allows that overland flow to infiltrate into soils, again reducing the amount of water that's actually reaching the river network.
Bare peat and unrestored peatlands can have quite large consequences for water quality. You can imagine that bare peat is actually taken away in the water courses and actually ends up in our reservoirs. So that means that the reservoirs have to be cleaned out. There's lots of silt in the bottom of those reservoirs. But it also discolours the water as well, because you get fine particles actually in that water, but you also get that brown colour in water as well. Organisations like Scottish Water have to clean up our water so it's actually acceptable from a regulatory point of view to actually drink. This costs quite a lot of money, so if we can do more with our wetlands and peatlands in the uplands and actually stabilise those so we don't get so much of this peat coming downstream, then there's a big advantage to that for everybody. The most important thing is that the peat is held in the place where it is rather than being transported downstream. And the act of restoring holds the water back for longer. It stops the erosive capacity of the water rushing down the streams and stops it taking that material downstream. But also by actually slowing the water down, a particular moss species known as sphagnum moss actually grows in the ditches, and it acts as a filter, so that water is being filtered through the plant system before it actually gets to a water treatment plant.
Damaged peatlands are a real concern for fisheries, largely for hydrology reasons and water quality reasons. From a hydrological point of view, lower summer base flows and speedier floods, larger flood peaks for shorter time periods have an impact. From fish migration point of view, further downstream limits fishing time. From a water quality point of view, water leaving these areas are more acidified, and that has impacts to do with fish survival, fish egg survival in particular. Increased silt levels can be a concern from a fishery point of view as well. Damaged peatlands are more likely to be eroding, more likely to put silt down. That can particularly damage fish spawning beds and even fish gills from the point of view of breathing in these sort of damaged soils. What's happened in some of these upper areas is we've actually lost particularly salmon populations, the trout, they've died out. There's people who still remember salmon up here before the heavy drainage of some of these areas. So if we can improve the water quality to actually allow fish to spawn again, and particularly for these fish to survive again, that has a benefit overall for the whole river system.
Thriving peatlands help create a healthy river ecosystem, which economically benefits fisheries, the water industry and tourism. Peatlands also influence land managed for farming and game.
Living and farming right next to a bog has its challenges. Water in the peat bog tends to seep and weep and drain onto the ground that you're trying to keep drained. And it's difficult for farmers not to just think drainage, but to think, how can I deal with that water without putting it all into my field drains? So what I would say is, it sounds a bit perverse, but if there's water coming onto your land as a result of seeping off a bog, why not think about stopping it coming onto your good productive land and just keep it on the bog? I've been using control grazing, and the cattle have made a huge difference to this ground, and it's now relatively good, particularly for my kind of cattle, grazing in the summer. I also now, in the last couple of years, have been experimenting with putting the cattle on the high moss itself. The ultimate result is that I have now got ground that before was not of any value at all. Now I have some grazing ground for the summer, but also it's doing a good conservation job.
Unrestored peatlands affect management in a number of ways. On the grouse moor, the herringbone grips, because of the heavy erosion, have turned into death traps for young birds. The mother hops across quite happily, but the chicks behind her drop in. Some of these grips too were up to 8 foot deep by erosion over the years. So it's probably a pretty major loss of ground nesting birds out there. I think that any natural system, and especially a grouse moor, is a wild or semi-wild habitat. It's managed by us, but it's really, you're dealing with a wild bird. So really any gains in biodiversity are going to benefit the food chain and therefore any of the living creatures that live on the land. For example, blocking the grips, the wetted areas or the small pools forming on the surface will be very good for general bug life and hence the birds that feed on it. And I suppose you could say that the area at the top of the hill that we've repaired is pretty useless for anything, having been reduced down to the bare peat. So hopefully when the vegetation re-establishes, it'll be good for biodiversity and probably a bit of sheep grazing as well. I would recommend restoring peatland because I do think that there are genuine long-term benefits to it, and I think anyone who's got degraded peatland should really have a look. Every bit of ground is going to be different. There'll be a huge variation in the expense and the costs involved, but because of the general public goods it will deliver, whether it's clean water or climate change or whatever, it's well worth looking at.
The challenges of managing forestry in deep peat are mainly economic. There are practical difficulties just because of the soft and wet ground conditions and the difficulties that poses for machinery access and building roads, etc. But primarily, most of the forests that were planted 40, 50 years ago, when perhaps environmental and other factors weren't so important, forests were planted beyond what was really sensible. The economic problem of forestry and deep peat is largely down to the value of the timber often being very low, particularly if it's lodgepole pine, which is probably the most commonly planted tree in deep peat. Even where lodgepole pine's growing well, you may only make a small return per hectare, and certainly not enough to recover the costs of drainage and replanting to establish a second rotation of trees. Quite often that cost may be in the region of £1,000 to £1,500 a hectare. Forests on deep peat are often very susceptible to storm damage, just simply blowing over because the trees don't root very well because of the wet ground conditions. In some parts of the country there would be problems because of the lack of fertility leading to poor growth, but the waterlogging can also impede the growth of the trees as well. As a forester, I like to see trees being planted. We still want to have some trees to produce timber and support the economy. It may be a consideration to look at restoring peatland. You can still clear the crop of timber in some cases and save a lot of the costs that would be required for replanting. A lot of land managers, foresters might be surprised at how often, not just environmentally but commercially, how it might actually work for them.
Restoring peatland is a significant step towards tackling many of these land and water management issues at source. Investment by business and landowners to achieve this is key to Scotland's environmental and economic future. There's a lot land managers can do to restore peatland.
We've put a bund, we've put a mound around a low part of one of my hay fields, which previously was really difficult to make hay because it was always wet. To create, if you like, a kind of pool, a pond, so that when the water runs off the bog, it's caught in this pool. Any overtopping doesn't go into my field drains. The other major work has been a series of 4 weirs and dams down the main watercourse that drains from the bog, so the water gets caught at the weir and then is pushed onto the wetland.
We had a series of herringbone grips put in, we think, in the 30s, probably done to drain the moorland to try and increase the vegetation for sheep. Those herringbone grips have been blocked up to stop the water running down, stop the erosion, and we hope that that's going to alleviate flooding downstream. We hope it'll increase the water quality.
I think the biggest challenge is the difficulty of actually getting things done on the site because of the ground conditions. Some areas are simply just difficult to walk on, let alone get in guys with chainsaws or heavy machinery.
Peatlands were long considered as being unproductive, but our understanding of their role in industry and the natural environment has improved. Good stewardship of these areas is an important and privileged task.
As far as the bog is concerned, I'd like to leave it in a much healthier state than when I took it over. A demonstration that farming and conservation works happily together.
I'd like to think that I will have at least contributed to an increased awareness of the importance of ecosystems. In Scotland we have 15% of all blanket bog in the world, so it's really important for us to maintain these ecosystems.
I think all of us would like to leave our patch in as good a condition as we can get it for future generations.
I would like to leave a more stable peatlands that are acting more naturally than they probably are at the moment.
From my point of view, if this sort of work can actually bring these fish back to here, back to the sort of numbers that used to be here, that would be wonderful.
I would like people in the future to see a good balance between forest land that is productive, adds something to the economy, balanced against resolving some of the problems from forestry in the past and improving the environment.
For further restoration guidance, visit our website and find out what makes our peatlands so important.
Hello, I'm Russell Hooper, the Peatland Action Project Officer for North East Scotland, and I should be talking you through the following video of Moss of Monday. If you bear with me, my computer has just logged out. Yeah, so here we are. We're on the eastern part of the bog. We're flying over the site here. The area has been impacted by historic peat extraction. So we're flying down one of the main drains here. This is 340 metres long, with several small drains coming in from the side. The small drains were quite hard to see on the ground, and the contractor initially missed damming these, but fortunately they were done before the site was finished, and you'll soon see the impact the dams had on the site. If you look up to the top left of the screen, you'll see further peat banks there. They're about 1.5 metres in height, and the peat depth in this area was around about 5 metres. These were to be reprofiled to prevent further erosion. Again, this is us just swinging round that southern section of the site. If you note the large drain there that's flowing between the willow trees, Scottish Water are quite concerned about the impacts of the degraded bogs in this area, and they have one of their water quality sampling stations on this drain, so hopefully we'll see an improvement with that over time. We also monitored the trees growing, surveyed the trees around the site, and those of low yield class were identified for removal. So at the top of the screen there's about 1 acre of trees which were identified for removal, as were a further 2 hectares, which we'll see shortly. And this is us 5 weeks after the restoration works. This would be about April 2019. And as you can see, the dams here, the peat dams, are having a fantastic impact, really re-wetting the site. A lot of water being held back and spreading away from the drain, even on those smaller drains coming in from the side. After 5 weeks, you can still see the impact of the tracks there. There's no damage done, but the site's not looking its best, especially at this time of year. So we are hoping to fly it again in June or July this summer to see the site at its best with the bog cotton flowering. Lower down in the drain towards the south here, we use composite dams due to the greater quantity of water in the ditch. Howell, who's on the panel with me from RSPB, he visited the site in late summer and commented on the damselflies, dragonflies, and also a green sandpiper using the wetter areas. It's really nice to hear of the biodiversity using the re-wetted site. Just coming around that southern section again, you can't really see the bare peat from that peat bank. It's been reprofiled. We also blocked gaps in the peat bank, and pools of water are forming nicely behind that. As you can see, the area of trees has been removed and the drying effect has been removed there, so that's a benefit. I do like my biodiversity on the site, so it's nice to capture some of the gulls flying over there. I'd like to think they're the black-headed gulls that nest in a colony in the western part of the bog, so nice to capture them. And towards the top of the screen there, that's the further 2 hectares that were flipped and the area ground smoothed, and we also put in some bunding and ditch blocking in that area to minimise impacts on the water courses. So that's just a quick overview, some of the benefits of the restoration work there for you. I'd also like to thank the RSPB Scotland for providing the drone imagery and bringing this project to fruition, and also my colleagues Fiona Mann and Eleanor Meikle for their help in bringing this video together.
Thanks very much, Russell, for giving us a walkthrough of the Moss of Monday this morning. Welcome everyone. My name's Julia Quinn. I'm one of the Peatland Action Communications Officers. Russell has introduced himself. He is a project officer based up in Aberdeen. Welcome to Hal Maggs as well, who's our Senior Conservation Officer for the RSPB Scotland. Both work together on the Moss of Monday. And of course, Andrew McBride, who joins me as well, who's our Project Delivery Manager. So just to start off the questions, to stick with Moss of Monday, were there any challenges bringing the project to fruition? And I'll maybe go to Russell first.
We did identify, initially we thought we had a larger area to work on, but we spotted that actually there was a different landowner for about a 5 hectare corner of the site. So we tried to get him involved, but as with many of the sites in the northeast where it's agricultural land and there's farmers involved, they're used to the agri-environment schemes where they're getting some financial benefit. So we had issues there. We weren't unfortunately able to get the ditch blocking done in that area or the scrub removal. And that's just a general reflection that we often come across in the bogs in the northeast area, where the Peatland Action Fund maybe isn't taken up so much by the farmers because we don't give them that financial benefit they're seeing elsewhere. But having said that, the agri-environment schemes don't always cover the works that we're wanting to do. In many of the cases, we might be wanting to carry out reprofiling, carry out bonding, and as yet these haven't been covered by the agri-environment schemes. So in some cases, if the agri-environment scheme has been done, we're not getting the full amount of benefit, but not seeing all the work's been done. I don't know if you've got anything to add on that, Hyle?
Yeah, well, just to re-emphasise the kind of motivations of a lot of the farming landowners of the peat bogs in northeast Scotland. They have a history of kind of engaging on land management schemes through agri-environment schemes, and as Russell said, it's the management payments that motivate them. They get 5-year management payments for doing similar things. Obviously, through Peatland Action Fund, you can do a much more meaningful restoration project, but they're used to getting these ongoing management payments. So it has been very difficult to get a lot of the other farmers in that wider landscape who have similar bogs to Moss of Kinmundy to engage in Peatland Action Fund, and that's probably the main blockage I would see. So just kind of thinking about resolving those kind of issues, I think, you know, it would be good to have a clearer integration between kind of the agri-environment scheme, the bread and butter for many of these farmers. That's the kind of the place they go to get resources for environmental management. Better integration with that agri-environment scheme or the new agri-environment scheme and Peatland Action Fund. So I think, you know, there's talk about having an outcome-based approach in the new agri-environment scheme and trying to link that more clearly to Peatland Action as a kind of precursor to getting sites into a better condition to then tap into future agri-environment schemes to have these management payments over time. It is a common problem we have in a lowland context. Could I also just pick up on a kind of a bit of a stumbling block we had with this project initially? We were kind of asked to speak to the council about planning permission, and so when we did this and we put in the official kind of request, a scope and opinion from the planners, it eventually came back with a message saying that yes, you do need planning permission, and this kind of delayed the start of the project quite considerably. So eventually we were told we didn't need planning permission, but there was to be fair, Nature Scott did all the legwork behind the scenes and smoothed it over to a point whereby we could just proceed. But it did cause a bit of confusion for planners and for us as practitioners trying to get the scheme up and running.
I'll just add to that. In Scotland, we've just had a consultation looking at permitted development rights, which includes peatland restoration as part of that. And I think we can see a way forward. The whole situation needs to be clarified with all councils. And I think having a permitted development right will go a long way to helping that. And hopefully in the future, we can smooth out some of those problems which delay the delivery of projects on the ground.
Thanks very much. For all of you there. We've had some questions coming in as we were talking. I'll ask Russell this one first. How will self-seeding regeneration be managed on this site with mature trees being so close to the recovering peatland edge?
Yeah, it is a concern, and as I say, it was surveyed prior to the tree removal, and the preference was for those larger trees to get into a second rotation. So it could be an ongoing problem. Obviously, we've re-wetted the areas around that drain and we would hope those areas, the trees would stay away from them. But yeah, it might be a case of ongoing scrub removal work away from the drains. So it's just something we'll have to keep an eye on and look to see if there's any more scope to re-wet the site as time goes on.
Excellent, thank you. Oh,
I'll just add to, sorry, I'll just add to what Russell said there. I think as the project as a whole, we are very opportunist, and we're looking at basically getting as much area restored as possible. And the lowlands are particularly important. And we found, not just in this project, but in past, we start a project and then we actually get more landowner buy-in over the years, and they allow us to do more as that trust evolves. So initially we don't get what we want, but we're around for long enough to actually make sure we get what we want in the end.
And a follow on one from Chris Miller. Have you considered the restoration of lag habitat around the edge of the bog? To Russell again, or Hal, sorry, either of you.
Yeah. Well, I can start off, and maybe Russell can pick up what I miss. It is complicated by the fact that this is a peatland that's surrounded by productive agricultural land, and you know, I've spoken to all the landowners, all the farmer landowners, and they are quite kind of sceptical about the idea of getting more water onto that one side because of the threat of kind of flooding on kind of prime agricultural land. So there isn't, I feel there's not much opportunity to restore lag fen around the edge. It'd be great if there was. We did talk to one farmer particularly about that subject, but he was not keen at all, really. So a lot of these lowland peat bogs have got this very deep peripheral drain around the edge, of course, and yeah, it's very difficult to get the surrounding farmers, if they're interested in producing arable crops, to entertain the idea of doing anything other than drain those kind of peripheral areas. Russell, I don't know if you've got anything else to.
Yeah, I think in this case we did try our best. We did speak to the landowner. Unfortunately, we weren't able to block that drain in the south of the site behind that peat bank, and it's one of those things you really don't want to impact on the neighbouring farmers, because you want to have a good image if you want to try and do work with these farmers in the future as well. So it's something we'd like to work towards. Again, if agri-environment schemes will give benefits to buffer areas, then it's maybe something that'd be more attractive to farmers. But yeah, by all means, it's something we would really like to do. But yeah, we need the landowner's permission, and yeah, we don't want to aggravate the neighbours, so to speak.
Just to add, on some of the larger sites, Moss of Kinmundy is a relatively small site, being about 50 hectares. On some of the larger sites, we have been looking at this, and you know, some of the sites are 300 hectares. That's 350 hectares is the largest lowland peatland we're looking at it in amongst this grouping. And I think there's more scope there to potentially look at restoring some of that fen habitat.
And a question coming in following on, have you considered land purchase in places where farmers won't necessarily be, you know, taking up these options because they don't get that payment? To Russell.
Yeah, up in the northeast here we have the partnership, the UG Peatland Partnership, which combines Nature, Scott, Peatland Action, SEPA, RSPB, the Council, Scottish Water, Scottish Whisky Association. There's numerous folk involved, and we do recognise the challenge obviously in this lowland area. And one thing we did raise in the last few months, I think, was this option of trying to get private investment to kind of fund the restoration in some sort of way. And yeah, land purchase was one of those options we've considered. So it's really something I'm looking into at present, with just how to develop a plan and approach private investors with a way to possibly take that approach. But yeah, it's something we're really considering, because at the moment we are quite stuck in terms of progressing some of these bogs. So yeah, something we'll look into.
Hal, I don't know, did you want to come in on that as well, or? that answers the
Not
question.
really. I think Russell's covered it there.
Yeah.
It's a challenge, and if the land was owned by private investors or a conservation organisation, I think that restoration would be a lot more straightforward.
A slight sidestep in a question, but interesting one. Do the old peat banks have a cultural value, given that they will be small carbon sources? To Russell again.
Could be considered. So I think at the moment there's still lots in the northeast. As I said, we're struggling to get a lot of the bogs under restoration. And I've worked on sites before where we have been quite happy to accept we can't get them all restored. And we do appreciate the values. They're not always done on all the sites. And yeah. And I just got an email from a local archaeologist from the council as well, wanting to just be informed and kept informed of any interesting finds. It's something we're very aware of keeping the council and the national bodies informed of anything of note we're finding in these areas.
I'll just come in there because it's obviously quite a big issue within Scotland from the point of view of on the Western Isles, in particular places like Lewis, where we have got a very strong tradition of peat cutting. What we're actually doing there, we're not eradicating peat cutting. What we're actually doing is those abandoned areas which are still actually eroding and still causing pollution problems within, for example, like freshwater catchments. We're actually going in there and reprofiling. I think the thing that we probably underestimate is the effect of these cuttings, because once they're abandoned, people assume that's the end of carbon emissions, but you can actually see the erosion. In a place like Lewis, the wind and rain erosion of the peat is significant, even at sea level. And so we are very aware that there is the cultural aspect of it, and we're actually in discussions with Historic Environment Scotland about how to maintain some aspects of peat cutting, but also actually to tackle, which is actually a very large job on places like Lewis. And the other thing to say is peat cutting is not so prevalent now, even in the Western Isles. It is basically dependent on fuel prices. And so the amount of peat cutting that goes on is quite minimal.
Thanks very much. We've had a follow-on question from the point that you raised, Hal, about the planning permission. And the question is, are there other barriers which get thrown up for other peatland action projects and lead to unexpected delays to restoration activity, licensing, historic environment surveys? We've just talked about the historic environment and species surveys. Perhaps go to Andrew on that one.
Yeah, virtually absolutely everything seems to come in away from doing peatland restoration. Yes, wildlife constraints are a major aspect, and we actually are looking at that now. That we're, as you may not know, we're on an annual sort of basis with our funding, and that has constrained our sort of long-term planning. But we'll be moving to much more longer-term planning in the future. And I think with that, we'll probably move much more into the similar sort of protocols that wind farms have, where we actually have license activity. And a lot of the disturbance issues are reduced by the fact that contractors are on site over a long period of time. The disturbance seems to happen a lot more when people are going on off site in a regular manner. But that's an aspect. Other constraints is deer. We have a sort of arbitrary threshold of about 10 deer per kilometre square, which we use if the overall estate value is higher than that. We will consider restoration, but only in specific areas and specific techniques. So we would only do restoration in an area where it was over 10. If we were doing basically reprofiling and damming of drainage ditches, we wouldn't think about doing mulching. We wouldn't think about reprofiling hags if it is at a high level. And basically what we're looking at is the condition of the ground, but also we have to take into account that deer management groups are moving in the direction of reducing deer numbers, and that's part of what we actually consider. But that's quite a big constraint that we have. And then also we have the shooting seasons for stags and hinds, which take up most of the autumn and winter. Have to fit in with those. Grouse shooting seasons, all sorts of things carbon actually comes in the way as well sometimes, because we've had, and Russell's had projects where we've actually got almost to the point of we're about to actually deliver a peatland action project, and the person suddenly decides they're interested in carbon, they see potential for carbon, and they completely pull out of it. So sometimes you can't guarantee, you've almost got to the final hurdle, and people sometimes pull out for various reasons, and it's financial reasons why people pull out. It is very fraught actually sometimes, but on saying that, we've covered 25,000 hectares in the last 7.5 years. We'll probably do another, overall as a programme, another 10,000 hectares this year. So there's a tremendous will in Scotland to actually push ahead with this, and that applies particularly for landowners who have a great deal of sort of trust with us. But I think the key thing for us is very keen prioritisation of what we do and a very large amount of flexibility. We are starting to develop ideas where we put a ring around an area and through our feasibility studies as well, and we will move within that area with any sort of given time according to what circumstances. Because sometimes we had a case last year where the project was ready to go, utility company were doing power line removals. That pushed the deer onto the area where the peat were actually going to go, the peatland restoration was going to be. So we had to switch to another area where we could actually move. And the same with the weather as well. We've set in with snow at high altitude, so we're working up to about 700 meters. So we have to be very flexible. And what we have is areas where contractors can pull off the hill and actually go and do less snowbound work at a lower altitude. So we're trying to build in as much flexibility as possible, but it makes the project a bit of a headache sometimes.
Well, picking up on the financial aspect that you were just touching on, Andrew, we've had a question. So acquisition of land by investors and investment equity firms with a view for carbon and natural capital seems to be increasing. How can Peatland Action link up with the land agents and that are involved in those sales and land management?
I think that it's very interesting that, because we have lots of inquiries and quite a few companies that are, like the example of Brewdog in Loch Lomond and Trossachs, have actually gone out and bought land themselves to do peatland restoration and peatland on. So some of those companies are quite proactive on how they do that. Basically, what we are doing now is pushing those companies towards the Peatland Code, but also the new land registry that has come forward with regards to recording various peatland transactions, and actually trying to develop the market in that particular way. But I think it's quite interesting talking to investors in what they want to invest in. I think they like the verification. They like two aspects of the verification. They like the Peatland Code aspect of verification, but they also like government involvement in projects as well. It gives a little bit more surety as well. And so we're just really trying to see what method works and doing different models of those methods to see how we actually progress. And we're working with the Peatland Code and various intermediaries as well. It is, I think the question is absolutely right. At the moment, there is a shortfall in actually meshing together the project we're running about 7 projects in any one year. It's meshing those projects with potentially with investors and government organisation. We want to eventually phase out as much of the government in intervention into peatland restoration projects and have more private capital actually filling those gaps.
And it's probably an important point to mention that the UK Woodland and Peatland Carbon Registry has just been launched. They've been brought together. So if you're not, that's maybe been touched on already in the conference, but it's one to have a look at with through Scottish Forestry, who are taking the lead on that, but we're working with them. Thanks very much. Well, we've got 5 minutes left. Andrew, I don't know if you wanted to pick up on some questions that were asked from Monday at all?
Yeah, sure, I can. Yeah. I noticed on the notice board there were a couple of questions, and I can give certain answers to those. I think one person was mentioning about we've got 600,000 hectares in Scotland that need some sort of restoration or remedial work. And the sort of emphasis on us is moving very quickly on that, with government targets with committing £250 million until 2030. We have got to do a lot work, and the question was asking about, well, should we work on a similar model to what happened to the Forestry Commission in 1919? And I think government intervention, yes, I think government can do a certain amount, particularly on where we can, from the point of view of apprenticeships and support like Peatland ACTION, technical support as well. But I think the private sector, and particularly with contractors as well, the private sector is very good at filling in some of these gaps, as long as there's consistency of funding and there's that long-term sort of profile of funding as well. And I think that's where the government and the private sector can come together to actually ensure that there is a market there. Because what we're basically doing, and I think all of us are doing this with peatland restoration, is we're creating a new industry. This is a completely new industry, and we have to think about it in quite a different way, how you facilitate that. In Scotland, we have particular problems with remoteness of a lot of our sites. I was on a site last week. It takes me 2 hours to get to the site, half an hour up track, and then another journey up from that to actually get onto the site where you're actually working. And these sort of issues mean that you need local. It's not just about peatland restoration, it's where people live, where and the sort of access to accommodation as well. So it's quite a wide sort of aspect, and I think that's where the government aspect can help in looking at in the round. I think actually delivery, our contractors, with some support from the point of view like apprenticeships and training and things like that, can expand quite a lot and quite quickly, and they're willing to do it as well. I think the other thing and I think it touched on how to do. In the last 3 years, we've done over 10,000 hectares. How do you do that? And I think we've got around about 20 largest contracting companies, and that obviously needs scaling up. But I think a lot of what we're doing in Peatland actually is very focused. We are very focused on delivery. That's the key thing. That's what we're measured by, and we have to deliver. There's no doubt about it. Time is running out for Peatland, well, not for peatland restoration, but from a climate point of view, and we have to act very quickly. And that's why we do focus very much on that. And I think the other thing that we should give credit for, we have very strong collaboration between lots of organisations in Scotland. Our stakeholder list goes to about 70 or 80, and that's not including land managers as well. So those land managers are very strongly committed to what we're doing. And I think one of the things in the future that I think they look forward to is certain amount of return for the long-term management of peatlands. And I think that's a key area we need to look at much more in the future, is how we maintain the peatlands to be restored and what is the financial return for those peatlands. I think the financial markets are woken up to peatlands certainly in the last 2 or 3 months, that it's the best investment, peatlands restoration, because that reduction in emissions is immediate, and that's what companies are looking for. They're looking for immediate reductions. They're not looking, say, for 10 or 15 years. They are looking for 10 or 15 years, but they're looking also for this very immediate. So I think the value of peatland restoration can only go up.
Well, you read David Bates's mind then. He said what returns would be available to the private investors. So we're on it.
We are trying.
Yes, yeah. Well, thanks very much. We've just got 1 minute left. I'm aware that Andy had asked a question as well that I've popped up online about the practicalities of the work at Moss of Kinmundy, so we can put you in touch with Russell and Howell, and you can get all our contact information from the exhibitor section as well, and I'll be there this evening at the drinks reception. So thanks very much to our panel, and thanks very much for listening.